Hi, I'm Malika Bilal, and you're in the stream. Today, Bolivia. The nation is still dealing with the fallout of a disputed election. So how will the country emerge from its political crisis? We want to hear what you think. Share your thoughts with us via Twitter or in our live YouTube chat.
I am Carola Fuentes. I am a journalist and I am also a filmmaker from Chile, and you are in the stream.
On Thursday, Bolivia's Congress is expected to debate an election bill that would annul a disputed October presidential vote. The bill would also appoint an electoral board tasked with organizing a new vote in the coming months. Evo Morales, Bolivia's first indigenous president and longest-serving leader, stepped down more than a week ago under pressure from the military, police, and protesters who alleged that he rigged an October 20th election in his favor. Questions, though, still surround the circumstances which led to his resignation and the declaration of a new interim president, Janine Áñez. Protests from Morales' supporters continue, and more than 30 have been killed in clashes with military and police. The ex-president Morales, now in exile in Mexico, has vowed to return. So with us to discuss what's going on in Bolivia, in La Paz, Diego Ayo, general advisor to Bolivia's Ministry of Communications. Also in La Paz, Raúl Peñaranda, a journalist, and in Buenos Aires, Argentina, Al Jazeera correspondent Teresa Bo, who just returned from reporting in Bolivia. Welcome, everyone, to the stream. It's really good to have you here. I want to start with the word that is in so many people's minds and tongues and on their fingertips on Twitter. So here with two tweets. This first from our community. Kafir says, if the military intervenes, that is called a coup. Elsewhere on the internet, of course, other opinions. Herta says, there is no coup in Bolivia. People got tired of Evo dictator, she says in a hashtag, violating the Constitution. He was in power for 14 years and he wanted more. He lost a referendum where people said no, but he manipulated the authorities to become a candidate anyway. That is not democracy. So two opposing views there, Teresa. Coup or not a coup, does it matter at this point?
Well, I think that in today's world where we're looking for a headline to simplify something as if it's a coup or it's not, and I think it's much more complicated than that. I think that Evo Morales committed many mistakes to reach the place where we are right now. It is, he was basically left alone by many of his supporters at that point. Many of the people within his cabinet resigned. In parliament, the same thing happened. However, and in spite of this, the minute that someone from the military asked him to leave, that has a very strong connotation in Latin America. Latin America has seen lots of, military dictatorships, of involvement of the military in the government. And I'm including countries like Venezuela, for example. And in this sense, it doesn't bring a very good note. So I don't believe in simplifying things. I think it's such a much more complex process that happened with Evo Morales, with him making lots of mistakes, like the referendum back, in 2016, and the irregularities that happened in this election. But at the same time, and I understand why so many people, especially in countries in Latin America, believe that a coup was involved in getting out of office because the military and the police were involved.
So, Diego, I want to bring you into the conversation via a few headlines that are circulating online. I'll read a few of them off to you. This from the Washington Post. Bolivia is falling into the grips of a brutal right-wing regime. Another, this from Salon. Who is behind the right-wing Bolivian botnet? After a violent coup in Bolivia, Twitter bots tried to nudge Americans to the side of the Bolivian far right. And this last one from the Gray Zone. Bolivia coup led by Christian fascist paramilitary leader and millionaire with foreign support. So these are headlines circulating, at least in the Western press. Diego, what do you make of them? Because you became the general advisor to this new interim government just about 3 days ago. Pretty new in the role. What's your take on how this is playing out?
I have to be really happy with all this news. The first thing I have to say emphatically is that this is not a coup. No, this is, I have to say, a fraud, an electoral fraud. This is verified. The main thing we need to stress on is on the elections. On the elections day, on this day, Evo Morales did a big fraud. That's something we have to say. First thing. Second thing is after that, in the 9 departments of Bolivia, in the 9 main places of Bolivia, we have a lot of multitudes, a lot of people saying Evo Morales, don't do that. We have to repeat the election. We have to have a new elections. I have to stress on that. In the 9 principal places of Bolivia, we have this kind of meetings, of popular meetings, demanding a new elections. Third of all, after all these popular and social interventions, we have the military and the police actions intervening. That's something we need to understand. It's not that the police come first or that the military starts these questions. No, they came after all of this popular resistance. And we have to say that we need to understand that the president made a fraud and that the people didn't want this final result. They went to the street and they have, I would say, the right to intervene. No?
Raul?
Yes. Well, I think that there is a good point here, but it's interesting to notice how in the international media now suddenly we have a coup and then also this supposedly fascist government. And that's not true. Maybe we have a conservative government, but there is no signs of fascism a lot around because the government has only 1 week in place. So and the government really has not taken any decisions that could be characterized as fascism or whatever like that. Maybe conservative, yes, but also this is a government that's going to be very short and only to call elections.
I'm sorry, may I mean, in the past few days, and I've been there, 10 people died in Cochabamba, in Sacaba, in Sencata, there were 8 people killed, again in repression from authorities. I was in both of them. We had and we saw the military security forces in general shooting at protesters that maybe had improvised weapons and maybe had some slingshots, among other things. I think the situation is much more complicated than what you're seeing it. And we're also seeing a government that you're saying that is going to be short, but that it has not been elected. And right now, and at this point, the most important thing is to call for elections because the government is not only transitioning. I mean, people are dying.
Exactly.
They're making important decisions of governance, for example, and among them, changing gas negotiations with Argentina, breaking relations with Venezuela and Cuba, among so many other things. And those are decisions that should be taken by an elected government. And that's why elections at this point are mandatory in order to pacify the country. And at this point, I'm not seeing any rush from the government to start making this move.
Well,
I want to pick up on what Teresa said, and I'll go back to you there, Raul, but I want to pick up on what Teresa said because this news came out recently, just overnight. Bolivian interim government proposes election bill as death toll mounts. And so, as we mentioned at the very top of the show, they're due to discuss this, so no date has actually been set for when that election will be. But in the meantime, Evo Morales has been speaking. There was a news conference on Wednesday, and this is what Morales had to say from Mexico City, where he is now. Have a listen.
After the coup, between November the 11th and the 19th, we have nearly 30 people killed by bullets. And I'd like to quickly highlight that this massacre is part of a genocide that is happening in my beloved Bolivia. We hope that international organisations will allow us to go back to Bolivia. And yes, I will go back there. I want to tell my comrades it may not be immediately, but there are a lot of ways to go back. And I will go back. I hope they guarantee us our lives. Just that. I'm not scared about all the threats, intimidations. We already know that story.
So, Raul, what do you make of that? He wants to come back.
Well, of course, he wants to come back, but and he's welcome. Nobody is accusing him yet of any crimes, except last night when we heard him speaking with a supporter and telling him that all the cities in Bolivia, that the protesters had to prevent the cities in Bolivia to have access to food. So that was the first time when the government said, hey, this is something this is a crime and we're going to sue you. But that process has not yet started. Teresa is right when she says that 8 people were killed in Sacaba, in the center of the country, and 8 were killed here in very near La Paz, in the city of El Alto, our neighboring city. But we have also to understand that why were those killings? In Sacaba, thousands of people wanted to cross a bridge and maybe get to Cochabamba, a city, and there was fears of violence and to maybe that those protesters were going to attack other civilians. So it is a hard decision for the police and the military. Should let them in and maybe more violence would erupt, or should I try to stop them? It is hard. And in La Paz, 2 days ago, when 8 people were killed, they were killed because they were attacking a fuel and a gas plant. They set fire to cars that were inside the plant, and they wanted to blow the plant. If that would happen, maybe now we can counting the deaths by thousands, because there were millions of gallons of gasoline, other fuels there, and these protesters were trying to set that on fire. So it's hard to make a decision. What should the police and the military do in that situation? But then we have, of course, people that are killed.
I think I wanted to add something that it's really important to say. If we see all the problems are growing, we're going to see more violence. That's something that is not in discussion. Teresa has all the reason when she says that all is going to get complicated. Of course, but we need to see the first moment, the initiation of this problem. And the initiation of this problem is a fraud. It's a president making a fraud. That's something we need to understand. I understand perfectly that the police now, at this moment, is killing people. Yes, and that is something tragic. We need to understand something that it's really real. Things are going complicated, are going more complicated, and it's something we have to admit. But we have also to say that the first moment is the moment we need to see with clear eyes. On the first moment is the fraud. If you make a fraud, everything that is going to last, that is going to come the next months or days, it's going to be complicated, of course.
So you mentioned several things there. And Teresa, I want to bring you back in, but someone is chatting live on YouTube and picking up on one of the things that Diego mentioned. And Diego said, if there's fraud, there's fraud. Ian here on YouTube says, where's the proof of crimes by Evo Morales? Can you back up for some of our audience members who are confused and who say, we haven't seen proof of any either irregularities or fraud? Teresa.
Oh, yes, it's for me. Well, I mean, there's the OAS report that there were irregularities. But for me, the most striking thing that really needs to be investigated is that when the counting process began, for about 20 hours or 23 hours, the system completely halted. And when it went back up, I mean, it was completely benefiting Morales' party. And that's something that has angered many people. That's one of the reasons why people took to the streets. I mean, I think that I'm really trying to put things in perspective here about who Evo Morales was in Bolivia, what he meant. When I started going to Bolivia 20 years ago, and you spoke to members of indigenous communities there, many women couldn't even get on a flight because they were discriminated against because they wore a skirt. Well, Evo Morales, in a way, changed that. And he has many, many positive things within his government. But something, did go wrong during the election and needs to be investigated and need to be clarified. And that what happened there is also part of what's happening today. However, and this is extremely important to me, does not justify what's happening in the country right now. You have an interim administration that at this point needs to pacify the country. They need to give reassurance to the people. even those who did not vote for Evo Morales, indigenous communities that did not vote for Evo Morales, but they're now afraid that they're not going to be respected, that they're not going to be represented because the Wiphala flag, the indigenous flag, was burnt, because they fear of what's coming next, because they see a Bible and a cross being brought into the presidential palace, because they see the repression that is happening to their communities. And I'm not seeing a government that is condemning that. I'm speaking at this point where we're seeing groups of people carrying the coffins into La Paz, and they're literally being repressed with tear gas by the police. Honestly, I mean, how do you believe you're going to pacify the country if this is the attitude of the interim administration, whose main priority at this point should be not only to pacify the country, but call for elections as soon as possible?
So one of the people holding up those Bibles that you mentioned was the interim president, Jeanine Áñez. She spoke on November 15th, and I want our audience to have a listen to how she described the changes that would be made by her government. Have a listen.
He was my brother. We want justice from this president-elect. How is she sending them to kill us like animals? If we are human beings, we are not animals for them to kill us like that.
I know. So that was actually Juana Limbo, whose brother was among 8 protesters killed in Alto. We had a little bit of a snuffo here, but we'll get to that in a minute. I want you to first have a listen to the interim leader of the country.
It is not a government that seeks vengeance. It is not a government that seeks a rematch. I think we have gone through unfortunate situations for many years, given that this is a state of law. Nonetheless, you will understand the natural claim of the supporters of ousted President Evo Morales. Because we are in a state of law, there should not be any restrictions on freedom of expression, restrictions on freedom of press, restrictions on the right we have to think differently, and what is worse, restrictions on our citizens' rights.
Earl, what do you make of those restrictions or the lack thereof? She says that there will be none, especially on the press.
Well, look, in Bolivia, we used to have an authoritarian government president, Evo Morales, that really limited the freedom of expression, put his opponents in jail, co-opted the free press, etc. And now we have a transition that is very hard and very difficult. But we have to make this a more complex explanation, as Teresa said before. Now we have supporters of President Morales blockading all the entrances to the cities. So, for example, in La Paz, we have food shortages. We don't have fuel, so there's not public transport or any kind of transportation, right? We don't have, because we cook with liquefied gas in Bolivia, we cannot have access to that gas. So it is a very difficult situation. So the President Áñez has a big challenge here, because President Morales is pressuring from Mexico to his base, to his supporters, to do all these things, because President Morales wants to prevent the calling of elections. The least interested in having elections in Bolivia is Evo Morales, because he's not going to be in the ballot. So he's doing everything possible in his hands to polarize even more the country, to get more violence, to avoid and to prevent to have elections. So yes, the government has been killing people, and this is very tragic and very negative, and something that we should criticize. But on the other hand, we don't have to forget that Evo Morales is calling to his supporters from Mexico to do all these things, attacking a fuel plant with explosives. So it is a hard situation.
Do you have proof?
And now
what's the proof of that? Where does that come from?
Well, no, there's videos and everything. So it is totally, it was in broad light, and the supporters were attacking this Sencata plant, which is near La Paz, because they are blockading the streets, so the fuel tankers.
No, I understood that point. I more so was asking the proof of it being Evo Morales asking for that to happen. There are people who believe that, though. I want to share this. This is a tweet from Aloe on Twitter, who says, Evo can stop by preaching to his fellow indigenous community. Although I think it will be better if he's allowed to complete his term and then bar him from political activities in the near future. But I know, Raul, you wanted to clarify what you meant.
No. Yes,
I
only
need
to say that from Mexico, Evo Morales has made many calls to his base and to his supporters to go to the streets and do these protests.
Diego?
I think there is a divide. We need to fulfill a duty. This duty is called elections. The first duty we have is to design a new president. We already done that. The second one is to design a new electoral tribunal. The third one is to make elections. On the fourth one is to have a new assembly with a new president. We are doing these things. We are trying to do that. That's the, I would say, main curve of the situation, the ascendant curve. Of course, it couldn't be so easy. There's a descendant curve. And I would say that at this moment, this curve is in the last moment. Just two departments are collaborating with this kind of a strategy, with this destruction strategy. Of course, there are dead people when we have to be really, really sad with this final resolutions of life. But we need to understand that at this moment, of course, we have a descendant curve led by Evo Morales with some components. The first one is the return of Evo Morales. The second one is not to do an election, as Raul has said. And the third one is to consolidate two presidencies. If we stay at this moment just lamenting, just crying because there are some urgencies, some social urgencies, we are gonna be not in the possibility of doing new elections. We need to understand that. We're not staying at power. We're not gonna stay at power for months or for years. We are gonna call for a new election, and the mass, the president's party could participate. That's something we need to know. That's really a democratic process. Of course, some people, and this is the final part I need to say, some people are dead, and that's something we need to regret. But these people were also weaponized. I don't know how to say, with weapons. No, they were attacking the police. It's not just that they were victims.
Right.
That's something we need to
I hear what you're saying, and Teresa, we would be remiss if we did not mention that at some of these protests, which have been peaceful, others have been attacked, including journalists. And so I'm going to play a little clip of the unfortunate events of what happened at one of those protests. Have a look at my screen here.
Soy turista, no soy turista. Yo soy la policía. I was just thrown tear gas by the police on purpose. This is what's happening in the middle of a plaza where people have been protesting peacefully. A police officer just threw tear gas on my eyes, so it's extremely difficult to speak. Very, very sorry. Clashes with those who are defending.
Teresa, it's incredible that you continue that report. Our kudos to you and glad that you're okay. But talk to us about what this means going forward for both protesters and for those who are trying to cover the protests.
No, I mean, I think that, the police at that point knew that we were live, that before, about an hour before, there was like a more violent protest with people trying to make it to the presidential palace. But at that point, the situation was completely peaceful. I had my tear gas in my hand. We were just explaining what was happening, and he just came to me and just threw, it was pepper spray, not tear gas. I later found out because of my swollen eyes. But, I think that what this talks about is, not all of those who have died were involved in violent incidents. One of the people that died in Sacaba was a man, an 18-year-old teenager who was transmitting live to the whole world what was happening there. So there's lots of also civilians involved who were not attacking the police or anything less. And I really think that
all the more
needs to be
reason, I'm
questioned.
sorry to have to pause you there, but all the more reason that we'll be keeping an eye on this story. Thank you so much, all of you, Diego, Raul, and Teresa, for joining us. And of course, there is more to come. We'll be following it online, aljazeera.com.